Good morning, everybody. Sorry we were a few minutes late. We had a little bit of the technology gremlins were not on our side. So welcome to this edition of Wise Women and Good Men. As you may remember, the focus this year, meaning 2026, is on leaders and leadership. We were fortunate in January to have a woman, Sarah Smith Orr, who's done it all. She took us from her days of being a manager of a large group to being a consultant to getting her PhD to being a professor to being an author and now mentoring many individuals. In February, we had two professors, which was interesting in terms of what is going on at school and college and leadership. In March, we were very fortunate to have two former city managers with a focus on keeping happy all of the constituent groups. And I'm thrilled today that we have two leaders in the foundation world, Jennifer Fleming Devoll, who was the president and CEO of the Pasadena Community Foundation for 22 years. Under her leadership, the foundation grew from 16 million to 250 million in charitable funds. She also introduced a lot of very interesting programs so smaller donors could collaborate with other donors and put together family foundations. Jennifer, about a year prior to her wanting to retire, which I'm sure she undoubtedly was looking forward to a peaceable existence, was there when the Eaton Fire happened on January 6th, 2025. Not standing alone, she jumped right into it, and now she's heading the Altadena Build Back Foundation, which is associated with the Community Foundation. Jennifer's also been an active volunteer herself, serving on the boards of foundations and leadership roles in community groups and civic organizations. Her successor, Khanh Russo, turns out to have worked at 9 other foundations, some of which also dealt with fire and recovery, and he has a specialization in housing. Jennifer is really focused on housing and the long-term recovery of what's going on in Altadena. Khanh hails from Northern California. He is a graduate of Claremont. Was that it? Did I get?
Santa Clara.
Yay! um, and he's been down here since 2025, collaborating with Jennifer and others. He's known for being a thoughtful, collaborative leader. He's also known for bringing his expertise in working with all the stakeholders. And as you probably know, one of the reasons that we're focusing on leaders and leadership is that there are so many different people we need to keep happy when we are in leadership roles. But before we dive into that, I just want to ask each of our guests, Jennifer first, what brought you to the Pasadena Community Foundation? What was attractive to you about it? Why were you there? Why are you still there?
My career was not particularly linear or planned. It's kind of a long and winding road, but the short version is, I entered college an English and French literature major, and I graduated as a human biology major. So I'm not sure what happened, but anyway, I took a left turn there. But I think I was always drawn to the helping professions. And I sort of found myself working on the marketing side of hospitals for many years. So that's kind of how I started my career in the world of hospitals. And then prior to coming to PCF, I actually worked in Boyle Heights for 12 years for a retirement community, helping. They had various levels of care. So I was, really working in the senior care industry, and that particular retirement community served low to moderate income seniors. And I'd wake up every day and drop my kids at school and leave town, essentially, drive to Boyle Heights and do my job. And I sort of thought, gee, it might be nice to wake up every morning and help my own community. So I kind of landed in the perfect place at the Pasadena Community Foundation. And it's been a great fit. It's been a place where you get to know your civic leaders, your nonprofit leaders, and just the people in your community. So it's been great. Enjoyed it.
Well, we all know what an excellent, amazing job you did in your 22 years, and we look forward to how you help Altadena recover. Although I'm sure your family would like to spend more time with you as well, being a relatively new and young grandma. Con, what about you? Since you've been at 10 different foundations, geez, it sounds like you, unless you were, 10 years old when you started, that you probably went straight into the foundation world after college. Tell us your story.
That's exactly right. My pathway was a little bit more linear from the philanthropic perspective. I think that what really drew me foundation from the very beginning is the sense of service and, giving back to the community. And because my family received so much from the community. So that's really what drew me. And I knew that philanthropy was really a chance to work at the intersection of like values and strategy and community. And I've always been really motivated by the question of how institutions can help people flourish. How can we unlock opportunity? And not just through like good intentions, but like really through disciplined stewardship. I think it's about meaningful partnerships, right? And foundations, I think we're really uniquely positioned because we can listen really carefully and invest patiently and bring people together around shared goals. And that combination is really what appealed to me. I love community philanthropy. This is my fourth community foundation. I've worked for some of the largest community foundations in the world. And what brought me to Pasadena was the opportunity to lead an institution with deep credibility, right? Really strong
Mhm.
roots and a real commitment to community in a really place-based way. Of course, following Jennifer was a gift, right? So love being able to build upon the incredible legacy that she had built. And I saw this truly help build in a way that is thoughtful and responsive, building on both my disaster response and housing expertise.
Well, I have to say, as a member of the Pasadena community, it's really wonderful to see how well the two of you collaborate. In my own line of work, I've seen many organizations where the transitions aren't as smooth. And sometimes the first person in after an individual has been there for 20 plus years tends to serve as a transition essentially. And it's the person after that that's the longstanding member. So I'm just pleased as punch, as we say, that the two of you work together. So, again, focusing on leadership, and I know a lot of people who listen to us are interested in this, and the notion that you mentioned all the stakeholders that you have. We talked about this last month with individuals who were former city managers, Phil Hockey and Cynthia Kurtz. But Con, how do you juggle all of the stakeholders and keep them happy without having to kind of compromise on your sense of ethics or ideals? Maybe you can give
Yeah.
us an example or two.
That's the hard part, right? How to
Yeah.
keep everybody happy. And just to be honest, you're not going to be able to keep everybody happy, right? But what you're wanting to try to do is accept that, leadership and philanthropy has always been relational. And you're never serving just like one audience, you're stewarding a network of
Mhm.
trust. And like I think for me, that just starts with clarity, right? Like it's going back to the basics. What is our mission? What are our values? And what does the moment require of us, right? And that's the unique thing about a community foundation because as a community foundation, what's required of us changes over time, and we're here for the long run. But once you're clear on that, stakeholder management becomes less about pleasing everyone and really more about being consistent, being transparent,
Mhm.
and being fair, right? So I try to listen for what's underneath people's positions. Donors may be asking about impact, while staff might be asking for clarity and support. Community partners are really making sure that we're being respectful and responsive to like their needs. And board members might be asking whether we're being faithful stewards. Those are different voices, but they're really often connected to me. So my approach, is, this is not rocket science. Listen really carefully, communicate honestly, even when it's hard,
Mhm.
make principled decisions and stay anchored in our mission. So you won't satisfy every preference, but you can build trust in how decisions are made.
Great, thank you. So, Jennifer, what about you? And I'm thinking about in this current job because there are a lot of politicians involved. There's the need to get governmental money, which I understand, has been a little bit stalled. So tell us about all the stakeholders, how you keep them happy, if you do, what's your approach, and anything else you might offer our listeners? Any nuggets of helpful insight?
Well, first of all, I mean, the Altadena Builds Back Foundation is really a part of the Pasadena Community Foundation's supporting organizations. So it's sort of, one initiative, if you will, that we are working on, in collaboration with PCF. Community foundations, I've heard them compared to like a Swiss Army knife. And I've always loved that sort of analogy because in some ways we are built to engage people in very different ways. So if you have a passion for the arts, there's a way to engage with you. If you want a lot of control over your own philanthropy, maybe a donor advised fund or family foundation is the right thing. If you're interested in, more collaborative giving circle, if you are interested in thinking about your legacy, I mean, so many things we can kind of meet people where they are. But I do think that what Con said about, understanding where we can add value and being really clear about that, and where we can't, and then honoring, what the donors are trying to accomplish through their philanthropy is kind of that through line that he was talking about. Community foundations are also, I mean, it's sort of interesting. We're sort of by design a perpetual organization. And so we're really intended to be here for the long term, but be nimble enough to respond to what's happening. So I think two things about that. One is, you mentioned the Eaton Fire. My work right now is very focused on Altadena, very focused on, recovery of housing in Altadena. We were set up to meet that moment, and we had donors that said we're very interested in the long-term recovery of Altadena with a focus on housing. And so that's really, in some ways, Altadena Builds Back Foundation is all about honoring the donor intent and what their goals were. At the same time, we are this and so the money that we raised for that is intended to be deployed for that, in a fairly short-term time frame. At the same time, community foundations, have a side to them that is, sort of endowment building and being here for the future. And I think that what Con said about, you may not agree with every grant that we make, but when you're creating an endowment or leaving a legacy to a community foundation, you're really trusting us to make good decisions in the future, because often gifts that we are receiving are after people even pass. And so they are trusting that process of thoughtful decision making, of honoring donor intent, of listening to the community. And so I think, really what Con said about building trust around decision making is kind of what we're about.
Mm-hmm. So, Con, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, but I'm curious because the whole notion of change leadership, you've landed in a position that you've already heard, and how successful Jennifer was. We all have our own individual leadership styles. So Jennifer has hers, you have yours. You inherited a staff. How do you, having done this, having been in 9 other foundations, how do you introduce change?
I think you join a strong institution like this, the first responsibility is not to prove yourself by changing everything, right? Like you said, this is already a very successful foundation with very strong leadership. And it's truly to listen well enough to understand what's already working, what is essential to protect, and where is there room to evolve. So my approach has been to start with listening to staff, to board members, to donors. I've had a chance to sit down with over 50 of our board, of our donors and community partners, right? Community partners that we're in relationship with, community partners that we need to be in relationship with, right? Like when I got here, there was a lot of issues that were surrounding the Jewish community. So, reaching out and making sure that, if we're not in relationship, we're really connected to folks who are experiencing a lot of tension or drama and pain. And to understand both the visible strength and the quieter opportunities, I think is really important as we're thinking about change. So I think change in that context should be in service of mission and not change for its own sake. So the way I think about it is honor the legacy, strengthen the culture, and build the next chapter. This may mean refining how we work. Um, I think my colleagues are gonna chuckle a little bit about that because I come from Silicon Valley, so the way I work is very tech oriented. So being thoughtful and careful about how we, even our operations, sharpening our priorities. I was lucky that when I got here, I inherited a wonderful strategic plan, right? That was really thoughtfully developed by the board and the staff. So I had a wonderful blueprint already, deepening partnerships. And I think the fires really opened opportunities to be in relationship and partnership with folks that we might not typically have been in relationship with, particularly with African American communities in Altadena. So that was wonderful. And then finding better ways to respond to emerging community needs. We know that public education here in Pasadena has a lot of opportunity with the recent bond passage. We know that affordable housing is a critical need that is coming up, and then community health needs are really important. But it all begins with respect, right? Institutions like PCF earn trust over time. We are 73 years old. We're approaching our 75th anniversary. And good leadership builds on that trust rather than trying to disrupt it unnecessarily.
I mean,
So,
I will just add to that, Khan has come and really leaned into, I think, the values and the brand of PCF. But so he's protected that, but he's also introduced new technologies, new efficiencies, ways to think about using AI in a healthy, thoughtful, productive way. So he is bringing change. Some of us are adapting more easily than others to the
yeah,
to
yeah.
the technology. But so I think that has been a good thing for PCF, right? I mean, t I always say that the more efficiently you can operate means the more money that goes out the door for
Yeah.
impact.
So, Con, with them, which by the way, Con sort of assisted this morning. We always log on a little bit early to make sure we don't have any of those technological gremlins, which we did have. And as it turned out, Jennifer was having a little bit of a issue with her camera, and he was able to solve it. I don't ask me. I couldn't tell you what to do. So we saw it up close and personal, as I say. So, all right, Con, what about the resistance? There has to have been some resistance to some of this change. I'm
Yeah.
just speculating, given because I'm an organizational development consultant and I see this. One of the things you did right is the rule of thumb is for the first 90 days, you don't make any changes. You listen, you talk, you go on the famous Hillary Clinton listening tour for at least 90 days. So that's our rule of thumb in the organizational development world, not knowing whether you did that or not. It sounds like you did. So have with obviously without naming names, I'm sure you've probably encountered a little bit of resistance. How do you handle that?
I don't know if I would frame it as resistance, but more about being more self-aware, right? I think that there were spaces and community organizations and community groups that had particular opinions or experience with PCF. And like for me, it's making sure that we show with a lot of humility and opening those doors and opening those channels and making sure that we're here to really listen and learn. So I think, internally, as Jennifer kind of alluded to, there's always a little bit of resistance as we are learning new tools and new processes, right? And candidly, I needed to do even more deep listening internally because I made some
Mhm.
assumptions about processes and tools that were wrong. So needed to take a step back, and then needed to also really deeply appreciate the incredible work and sacrifice that the team had done in the past year, right? When the fires hit starting in January 2025, it was 150% all the time, right? So I think,
Mhm.
I needed to take a step back and really honor the incredible work and sacrifices of the team as I was thinking about how do we, move forward as an organization.
Thank you. And what about you, Jennifer? You're in a different kind of role. What have the specific challenges been in terms of your leadership profile, and what are you doing to meet the moment, as they say?
Yeah, well, I think a huge challenge. So, just to be clear, I left, PCF and moved to the Altoona Builds Back Foundation in a much more narrow and focused role.
Yeah.
Um, and the learning curve for me was, disaster response, as well as, with our focus on housing, kind of how do you support the rebuilding of residential housing in a way that, supports an equitable recovery in Altadena? What are the disaster frameworks that, you know, people who've been through this before, um, just understand how FEMA works, how um, disaster case management works, what a long-term recovery group is. It's a lot of vocabulary, a lot of kind of processes to absorb. What was great is having Khan bring all of this expertise. He's been a great
Mhm.
support to, that work with the Altoona Builds Back Foundation. So that's one big challenge is just the learning curve. I think also, the pace at which all of this is going, understanding the incredible scale of this particular disaster and the trauma of people who got up at 2 in the morning in their pajamas
Yeah.
and, left home with one car and never, thought they were coming back and lost everything. And so that I think, Pasadena Community Foundation and hopefully Altoona Build Back Foundation, we were well suited. I mean, we're in the community. It's part of our, it's part of our ecosystem. So just being patient and listening and trying to understand what people need. I think we really value the solutions that we come up with and the activities that we fund as being very much community driven. And so just taking the time to listen, to be out in the community, to understand what people have been through. There's also been some unique things about this particular fire. Um, we mentioned the scale. I think the difference in the way that the federal government has responded, and sort of trying to understand maybe even where that's going, is a little different than maybe in past disasters. Um, so
Very dramatically stated, Jennifer. Sorry.
um, and I think they're also, frankly, Eaton Fire is a little bit different than the Palisades in that we have,
Yeah.
the Edison um, situation, the Southern California Edison. There is potentially settlements that people can access either short-term or long-term through a voluntary compensation program or through litigation. And so sort of managing what that means, what the role of that is in disaster recovery. And I think there's been some incredible innovations trying to understand lending innovations, 0% loans, kind of new types of mortgages and constructions loans that are accessible to a lower to moderate income population, where maybe traditional financing is not accessible to that. So all of that is sort of a big patchwork quilt of learning curve.
Yeah, and
You
what I
know,
might add to that too, Dana,
wait,
is, to complement the rebuilding efforts, and Jennifer alluded to this, right? The mental health needs are still real. People are still dealing with trauma, and this is
yes.
trauma that they're going to need to work through the next 3 to 5 years, if not their whole lives, right? The child care and the food assistance, all of those are still continuously critical needs. It's not as if we had one phase and we're moving to another phase. One of the challenges with what's happening with the federal funding is that they're putting a lot of pressure on local funding and local budgets, right? Whereas a lot of this funding would have already come, and then we will be able to distribute that for rebuilding needs, for fire response and recovery needs specifically. the county is put in a precarious situation where they kind of have to shift money around, right? Shift money that they had earmarked for other purposes for fire. So, in most situations, that's typically not the case, right? Like we would have additional resources to come in and support, but now
Yeah.
the county has to balance the current plans with additional fire needs.
Yeah, and I will say that our as those who are listening who do not live in LA County, we've had a very small, we've had five person board of supervisors for a huge area. Some of them, in fact, I think our supervisor has an area that's larger than some countries, and she's really stepped up and came and worked very hard and very focused, just as Jennifer took that role. I'm going to switch things up a little bit. While we were preparing to go live, I was being Diana Downer, aka Debbie Downer, because of the impacts on my own personal family. And I was so relieved because Jennifer started talking about the silver lining. She started talking about all the good things that are coming out of it. So tell the group some of those silver linings and how leadership intersects with those, Jennifer, and then Con.
Well, I just would first say I don't want to diminish in any way what people are going through personally, because it is a
Mhm.
lot and it's a disaster and it's, it, but that said, I do see neighbors coming together. So there was a group that emerged all together, which is sort of a block captain model that has been used in other disasters. And so, there was leadership that stepped up and formed that model, took notes from um, other areas that have been through that disaster, and it's really about neighbors helping neighbors and about neighbors communicating with neighbors. I would say that's also true of the Eaton Fire Survivors Network that uh, is led by Joy Chen, and
Mhm.
that is on a Discord platform where, if you have State Farm insurance and 10 other people have State Farm insurance, you can talk about your experiences, you can share information. Um, and so that community building, that neighbors relying on neighbors and helping neighbors and supporting each other, I think has been real. I've heard people say, I know my neighbors better now than when I'm not living in Altadena than when I lived in Altadena. So, I think that's a wonderful thing. I think there have been some innovations on the kind of the financing, mortgage lending side that are starting to emerge. People realizing that you need to make this, you need to have patient, capital accessible to a broader swath of people. So not that, not just wealthy people can recover and come back, but you also allow, for the full spectrum of the Altadena community to have a chance at
Yeah.
rebuilding and coming back home. So there,
Yeah.
I think the innovations and the kind of community spirit is really strong.
Yeah, I see a lot of people walking around with T-shirts that say Altadena Strong. So the neighbors really coming together is so important. So Con, what about you? What are your observations? Obviously, a relatively new kid on the block, but I'm sure what are the silver linings that you would add to what Jennifer said?
Yeah, I would definitely build on what Jennifer has said. I've I've never been in a situation where the folks in the community have so much agency, right? Like they're not asking for permission to do anything. They see what needs to be done and they just do it. And they do it with a
Mhm.
level of expertise and caliber and care and heart that I've never seen in any other community or any other disaster I've been in. Collectively, we've raised over $1 billion for humanitarian needs, right? Like that's the biggest fundraising effort ever in the history of America for a disaster, but that pales to like the 34 billion that we're waiting for the federal government. So let me just be clear, although I'm inspired by that, I think building upon what Jennifer said also about artificial intelligence, right? Our planning departments at the city and the county level are using artificial intelligence to make sure that we are reviewing and applying, that tool to make to approve permits more quickly. community groups like Builders Alliances using that tool to help people understand, you just put in your APN number and then you know what types of plans can fit there and then what it is that you can and cannot build very quickly. So we're using these tools and these innovations in ways that, the disaster has spurred, right? So gaining efficiencies in ways that I've never kind of seen before, which is really inspiring.
I just it prompted in my little pea brain here. My son-in-law was called at 3 o'clock in the morning to go up to his block with some other neighbors, and they were the guys with the hoses that ran out of water, and they were stomping out embers. But a good Samaritan came by and showed them all how to turn their gas off, the gas meters, because apparently those were, sparking, not intended, a lot of the fires. So it is amazing how the amplification that one good deed can do. Okay, guys, believe it or not, we're getting close to the end, but I do want to hear what each of you would say are the top 3 to 5 leadership traits that you would share with those who are listening. And how about starting with Khan? And then
I love this
Jennifer can add to the
question.
list.
I love this question because I grew up very much through a servant leadership model, right? Like,
Mhm.
so I've shared this with some folks, but I went to Santa Clara University to become a Jesuit priest, and that was kind of my initial kind of pathway. So very humanitarian from the very beginning. So I hope the kind of characteristics that I carry and what I hope to espouse is to start with humility, right? Because leadership starts by knowing that you don't see everything on your own. And I've learned that the more responsibility you carry, the more important it is to stay teachable. Um, the second thing is clarity, right? People just need to understand where you're headed and why and how decisions are being made. And I think that clarity reduces anxiety and builds upon alignment. That's also partly why we rolled out a new brand. Like that work started before I got here, and it was just serendipitous that, from a timing perspective, that we were able to introduce a brand that was really about roots and about how
Mhm.
we stay committed to this community. As a leader, courage is really important, right? Because leadership requires making difficult decisions. I've worked for elected officials before, and I always am reminded, like, you're elected to make hard decisions, right? And particularly when the path is not obvious and when there are competing goods or tensions, that courage is even more important.
Mhm.
Empathy, right? Not as like softness, but like as discipline. So if you want to lead people well, you have to understand what they're experiencing and what matters to them. And then maybe lastly for me, and because my bias is towards community philanthropy and community foundations, it's stewardship, right? So we are entrusted with resources and relationships and public confidence, and that trust has to be earned over and over and over again.
I love your characterization of empathy. And it is not a soft skill, it is a hard skill. So thank you for that. So, Jennifer, what would you add to that list?
I think what I would add is maybe two things. I mean, I agree with all of the above. I think one is communication, and in a nonprofit in particular, we have a big part of the leadership of a foundation is the board.
Mhm.
And we live the work every day. Board members do not. They bring valuable expertise and resources, but I think communicating with the board is important, that you don't get ahead of the board, that you bring them along, with your vision and your initiatives and so forth. So, keeping them informed, communicating, I think that's, true with all stakeholders. Communication is important. Um, and Con has recruited some fantastic new board members to PCF. We've
Oh,
always had a really strong board. We have 4 new board members. So, getting them up to speed and, orienting them to PCF and what a community foundation is important. And I think the other thing is, for me, and I know there are different leadership styles, but, for me, I think walking the walk a bit is important for a leader. I think if you expect your team to work hard, you should work hard. If you expect your team to show up on weekends and evenings, which is part of our philanthropy, you just have to do that. I think you have to show up on weekends and evenings. I think if you want work-life balance, you have to give that to your team. And so I think just, that's important. Um, One of the things I think that PCF did a while back that I think was a great moment was, we had a retirement plan that was tiered basically. If you were more senior, you got a stronger employer contribution to your retirement. And we decided that that was not the right thing, that we should make it equal. And so now we have every single team member gets the same employer contribution percentage to their retirement plan. So I think things like that are important in terms of
Yeah.
sort of just walking the walk and
Yeah.
you know.
It's not what you say, it's what you do. I have worked in and worked for many where they have these. There was a period of time when everybody was hiring the marketing gurus to come up with whatever your values in some succinct form. And I worked for a place that, without naming names, that had the three C's. And then the CEO was just shocked that people weren't doing it. Well, he wasn't doing it. And you really have to lead by example. I mean, people don't really care what you say, they watch what you do. So thank you for that. Okay, so what haven't I asked you that each of you would like to add to the conversation? Jennifer, why don't you go first?
I think one of the things I would say is that I've come to understand that there are lots of different leadership styles, many of which can be effective. And I remember there was this book called Quiet. It was written by Susan Cain and it came out, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or something. And there was a comment about the book. I'm going to see if I can find it. I wrote it down because I thought it was interesting. So the comment about the book, sort of a reviewer said, Quiet is an engaging and insightful look into the hearts and minds of those who change the world instead of tweeting about it.
Huh.
And I think that book made me, I think, more comfortable, with my own style of leadership, which is fairly calm and quiet and sort of steady. And I think there are many leadership styles that can work. And sometimes I think there are leadership styles that work for an organization at one point in time, and a different leadership style is needed for another point in time. I think about this transition now from, Steve Jobs to Tim Cook. And now Tim Cook is stepping aside for whoever's
Yeah.
the new guy. And, very different leadership styles for very different times of, Apple's development. So I think just appreciating that there's no one particular personality or characteristic that makes a good leader is something that sort of I've come to learn over time, maybe through feeling insecure about not being, a charismatic, extroverted leader.
Yeah.
So I'm
Yeah.
now sort of comfortable in my own shoes, I guess.
Right. Well, you have to be authentic with whatever you do. But the notion that you raised is called, in my world, situational leadership. So there are times when you need different leaders and leadership styles. And sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not. But it is really critical to be who you are. And by the way, Jennifer, I've heard about you over the years that um, all the way back to your interview for the position, how prepared you were, how much homework you had done, the presentation that you made. And you are known for knowing probably more than the people you're going to be speaking with about them or about the project, and a very kind of analytical approach. I am personally, I'm kind of a big picture person. So somebody who I would contrast myself with, maybe an analytical thinker that goes A to B to B to C to C to D. I go A to Z and then back down the alphabet. And honestly, at one point I was an officer in a utility. There were 18 officers, 17 men and me. And I remember thinking that we would be in meetings and I'd say something and there'd be stunned silence. And then 5 minutes later, one of the guys would say the same thing, not as articulately, of course. And they'd say, Joe, good, point. And somebody, I worked with what I do now, an organizational development consultant who said, explain the difference in, being analytical, and I was working with engineers, et cetera, versus being kind of more strategic, shall we say, or just conceptual or whatever they wanted to call me at the time. And it was a woman, and she said, hold your idea and wait for 5 or 6 minutes. And of course, I also thought, well, it has to be because I'm a female, so it must be because they're all men and I'm the only woman. And she said, hold your thought for 5 minutes and see what happens. And I did that. And I realized there was a lot more receptivity to it because the difference in how my thinking style versus theirs. And I mean, we were able to meet at that point in time. So it's interesting because of the work I do now. I mean, I was left to believe, oh, it must be because I'm the only woman here, as opposed to no, it could be because you have a different leadership style. And that's what it was. So, Khanh, what do you want to add to this dialogue that we haven't discussed? I'm sure a lot. But...
Well, first of all, I just want to add to what you've just shared about Jennifer. That's been definitely my experience, right? She shows up not only prepared, but the most gracious, the most diplomatic, the most wise person. And I continue to be so grateful to be in relationship and partnership with her. Something I would add that leadership for me is really an act of service, and particularly in philanthropy, right? Because philanthropy is really about the love of humanity. And like titles matter far less than whether people feel seen and whether institutions behave with integrity and whether communities are stronger because we showed up well. I also think that leadership is deeply local, and community foundations are powerful because we're close enough to listen, to respond, to really just stay with the community over time. And that matters to me. And finally, I would say that optimism is a part of leadership, right? And like, not like naive optimism, but the belief that when people come together with like generosity, discipline, and shared purpose, real progress is possible. And that belief is part of what makes this work really meaningful for me.
I would just say that Khanh has brought to PCF an orientation of abundance. And I think that's been so great, because I think when I started, I had a little bit of an orientation of scarcity. We were very small. We didn't have enough money to do much, to make much impact. But, what I've learned, and I think what Khanh really I appreciate about him is he just comes with optimism and abundance. And, it's not like if you build it, they will come, but it's, it just comes from a very good place. I think that's a good spirit to have at a community foundation.
Well, it may well be from that Jesuit training he was talking about. That, to me, was totally out of left field. I would love to have a different conversation about that and about Pope Leo, et cetera. Believe it or not, we have come to the end of our conversation. We could go on and on and on. And I want to thank you both for the insights, for the work that you do, for the optimism, the abundance, such a wonderful note to leave on. And for those who are listening, this conversation will be uploaded to my YouTube channel, my name, Diana Peterson-More, and later onto my website, which is www.dianapetersonmore.com, no hyphen, 1 O in the more. And there was just so much I learned, and I love to do these conversations because I learn information that I can then share with others. And to invite you all to come to next month, reminder, we are the third Tuesday of the month from 10, assuming we don't have technological gremlins, to 10:45 Pacific time. And next month, we have 2 leaders of 2 large nonprofits. One of the things we also didn't get to discuss today is that Pasadena is blessed with the second largest number of nonprofits in the country, and therefore probably the world, second only to Washington, D.C., and so many partnerships among the many nonprofits that I'm sure you were working with. So thank you again, Khanh Russo, current President and CEO of the Pasadena Community Foundation, Jennifer Fleming Devoll, who is the immediate past President and CEO of the Pasadena Community Foundation and now heads Altadena Build Back Foundation, affiliated with the PCF, really focused on long-term sustainability, rebuilding, and housing specifically. We also didn't get to find out how long you plan to be at that helm, Jennifer, but that's a conversation for another day. So thank you so much, and hope to see you all next month.
Thanks very much, Diana.
Thank you.
you.